The day my youngest son told me, "Mom, you shouldn't come to the party, you'll embarrass us," something inside me broke. I stood there, holding the old purse I'd carried for years, its leather cracked and faded like my hands. He was wearing a designer suit I'd paid for long ago, though he didn't remember that. His wife stood behind him, arms crossed, her perfume heavy in the air. I smiled that weak, practiced smile mothers wear when they're dying inside and said, "Of course, darling. I understand. I'm Margaret, and I've spent my life raising 3 children in a quiet Chicago suburb." But that night, the home I built, the family I cherished, everything I believed in, he didn't know that behind that smile was 20 years of silence, 20 years of pretending, 20 years of a lie so deep I sometimes forgot who I was before it began. It all started after my husband died. He was a good man, a quiet man, and he worked his entire life to build what we had: 2 small businesses, some land, and a modest house that felt like heaven to us. When he passed suddenly from a heart attack, the world didn't just feel empty, it felt cruel. My children were already grown. Michael, the eldest, smart and ambitious. Sarah, my only daughter, tender but often distant. And Eric, the youngest, my wild one, the one who could charm anyone with his smile. When the lawyer read my husband's will, I saw something flicker in my children's eyes that I'll never forget. Not grief, not love, but calculation. Property, money, inheritance. My husband had left everything in my name, perhaps thinking that would keep the peace. He was wrong. In the weeks that followed, the phone calls came polite at first. "Mom, maybe it's better if we manage the house for you. Mom, you don't really need 2 properties, do you?" And then, less polite, "You're not getting any younger. You should think about us." It was Michael who said it most bluntly. If you don't plan properly, the family will fall apart. The family, I realized, had already fallen apart. So, one quiet morning, I made a decision that would change everything. I sold one business and put the money somewhere they couldn't touch. Then I called the lawyer and rewrote my will. I left specific instructions, but those would come later. Finally, I packed a small suitcase, took only what I needed, and told my children I was retiring to a small rented house on the edge of town. They didn't protest. In fact, Michael even said, "It's for the best, Mom. You shouldn't have to worry about managing money at your age." They didn't know that I wasn't retiring. I was watching, testing, waiting. The house I chose was humble, but clean. Peeling paint, a leaky faucet, thin curtains that danced with every breeze. I learned to cook simple meals, wear secondhand clothes, and live on a fraction of what I had. I didn't tell a soul about the bank account or the investments under my name. To them, I was just a poor old woman living alone, surviving on a small pension. The first few months, they visited, out of obligation, I suppose. Sarah brought groceries once, left them on the table, and checked her phone the whole time. Michael came when he needed a tax paper signed. Eric, my baby, came most often at first. He would hug me, call me mama, and tell me he'd make it big one day. But as years passed and his world grew larger, parties, girls, business trips, his visits grew shorter, then rarer. Loneliness became my daily companion. I'd sit by the window with my tea, watching other families walk by, children pushing their mothers in wheelchairs, sons carrying grocery bags, daughters linking arms with their aging parents. I'd whisper, "Would mine ever do that for me?" Sometimes, I'd test them in small ways. I'd call Michael and say, "The roof is leaking. I'm afraid it'll get worse." He'd sigh and say, "Mom, you really should move to a care home. I'm too busy with work right now." Sarah would transfer a small amount of money and text, "Hope this helps." "Busy this week." Eric would promise to come by and then forget. The pain of being invisible is worse than hunger, worse than cold. It eats at you quietly until you start to wonder if you ever mattered at all. One winter, I fell ill. Nothing serious, just a fever that lingered for days. I didn't want to bother them, but I called anyway. No one answered. 3 days passed before Sarah texted back, "Sorry, Mom, was at a conference. Feeling better?" It was Mrs. Henderson, my 70-year-old neighbor, who brought me soup and sat beside my bed until I could stand again. She was the kind of person my children would have dismissed as a nobody. But when she held my hand and whispered, "You remind me of my sister," I realized love doesn't need blood. Years turned into decades. The world changed, new phones, new cars, new trends. My children prospered, each in their own way. Michael became a successful real estate developer. Sarah married into wealth and lived in a gated community. Eric struggled. For a while, he borrowed money from friends. From me, though he never repaid it. I never asked. He was still my son. Sometimes, when they posted photos online, family dinners, luxury vacations, I'd look at those smiling faces and wonder if they ever thought of me. Then, on my 80th birthday, something unexpected happened. Sarah called. Her voice was unusually soft. "Mom, we want to do something for you. A small family dinner. Just us." My heart fluttered. After all these years, maybe they remembered. Maybe they still cared. I wore my best dress, though best by then meant one that wasn't frayed at the collar. I tied my gray hair neatly, added a touch of lipstick, and took the bus to Sarah's house. When I arrived, I could tell it wasn't for me. The table sparkled with expensive wine. The laughter was loud. The conversations had nothing to do with birthdays. I was more decoration than guest. But I stayed for the fragments of affection that might fall from their words. Later that night, when I tried to help clear the table, Eric whispered, "Mom, maybe you shouldn't touch the plates. They're expensive." That was the moment it clicked. 2 decades of pretending, 2 decades of silence, and now I finally knew. They saw me as poor because they never saw me at all. That night, when I went home, I opened my husband's old chest, the one that held the real papers, the deeds, the truth. I looked at the faces of my children in the framed photos and said quietly, "I think it's time." When I reached her apartment that night, the door was unlocked. The lights were dim, and when morning came, I sat at the edge of my bed for a long time, holding my husband's wedding ring in my hand. The air in that small room felt heavy with memories, the faint smell of his old cologne still clinging to the wooden box where I kept our life's papers. For 20 years, I had watched our children from afar, seen the rise and fall of their fortunes, the way they spoke to me only when convenience called. I had pretended to be poor to know who truly loved me, but now, as the truth neared its moment of revelation, I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. Still, I had made a promise to myself and to him. The time for silence was over. That afternoon, I took a taxi into the city. The driver, a kind young man with tired eyes, tried to make conversation. "Visiting family, ma'am?" he asked. I smiled faintly. Something like that. He didn't know that. In my bag were the documents that would turn my children's world upside down: property deeds, bank records, and a sealed letter addressed to each of them, written years ago in trembling handwriting. My first stop was the lawyer's office. He was an old friend of my husband's, gray-haired and gentle-spoken. "Mrs. Langford," he said, surprised when I walked in. "It's been a while. I think it's time," I told him, "for the truth to come out." He nodded slowly, as though he'd been waiting for this day too. We went through every detail: the hidden accounts, the trust fund, the letters. I signed the final document, my hand steady despite the storm inside me. When it was done, I felt strangely lighter, like I'd been holding my breath for 20 years and was finally exhaling. Before I left, he looked at me with quiet admiration. "You've done something remarkable, you know. Few people could live with such patience." I shook my head. It wasn't patience, Edward. It was heartbreak. That evening, I returned home to find Eric sitting on my porch. My heart jumped. He looked thinner than I remembered, his face drawn, his eyes restless. "Mom," he said softly, "I didn't know where else to go. For a moment, I forgot everything: the hurt, the distance, the disappointments. He was still my boy. I opened the door, and he followed me inside. He confessed everything: the failed business, the debts, the drinking. His wife had left, taking their daughter with her. "I messed up, Mom," he whispered, tears in his eyes. "I don't deserve your help, but I didn't know who else to call. I made him tea, sat beside him, and listened. I didn't scold or cry. I just let him talk until the weight in his chest began to ease. Then I said quietly, 'Eric, I don't have much. But what I do have, I can share.' He looked at me, guilt burning in his eyes. 'You've done enough. I shouldn't even be here.' I smiled, gently. 'You're my son. You'll always be welcome here, even when the world isn't.' He stayed the night. When he slept, I stood by his bedside, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead like I used to when he was small. And for the first time in years, I felt something like peace. The next morning, I made pancakes, and we ate together quietly. Between bites, he said, 'Mom, I wish I'd been there more.' His voice cracked. 'I was stupid. I thought money made a person worth something.' I reached for his hand. 'We all learn, my dear. Some just learn when it's too late.' He stayed a few days, helping around the house, fixing things that had been broken for years. I didn't tell him about the truth I'd set in motion, not yet. Something inside me needed to see if this change was real or only born from desperation. A week later, Sarah called. She never called twice, so I knew something was wrong. Her voice trembled. 'Mom, can we talk?' When she arrived, she looked different, tired, pale, her expensive clothes hanging loosely on her frame. 'David and we're separating,' she said, staring at her hands. 'He's keeping the house. I don't know where to go.' It was strange how life turns. The daughter who once told me I wouldn't fit in her neighborhood now sat at my worn kitchen table, asking if she could stay for a while. 'Of course,' I said quietly. 'This house may be small, but it's home.' In the evenings, the three of us sat together, me, Sarah, and Eric. We cooked, we laughed a little, and for the first time in 2 decades, it almost felt like family again. Almost. But every time Michael's name came up, the air changed. He hadn't called in over a year. The last time I saw him, he'd been giving an interview on television about his new development project, smiling like a man who owned the world. He'd made it clear, years ago, that he had no time for sentimental distractions. But fate, I've learned, has a cruel sense of irony. 3 weeks later, he came too, but not out of love. He came because word had spread that I wasn't doing well. Someone had told him I'd been living alone, maybe losing my mind. I saw the concern on his face when he arrived, but I also saw something else behind it: suspicion. 'Mom,' he said, pacing the small living room, 'why didn't you tell us about your finances?' 'About how bad things were?' I looked up at him, calm. 'You never asked, Michael.' He frowned. 'We could have helped. You should have said something.' Sarah crossed her arms. 'Helped? You never even called her.' The argument that followed was years of silence exploding all at once. Accusations, guilt, denial, everything we buried under polite distance came roaring out. Eric finally slammed his fist on the table. 'Stop pretending we were ever there for her. None of us were.' The room went quiet. I stood, my voice steady. 'Enough. This isn't about blame anymore. It's about truth.' I went to the cupboard, took out the old chest, and set it on the table. They watched in confusion as I opened it. Inside were neatly arranged folders, sealed letters, and documents yellowed with time. 'What's all this?' Michael asked. I met his eyes. 'The life you thought was gone.' Their faces went pale as they saw the deeds, the accounts, the trust documents bearing my name. I had never been poor, not for a single day of those 20 years. Sarah gasped. Eric covered his mouth. Michael just stood frozen. I said quietly, 'I wanted to know which of my children would still love me when I had nothing to offer. Now I know.' None of them spoke. Only the ticking of the old clock filled the silence. The next few days were a blur of tears, anger, and desperate attempts to convince her to go to the police. She refused at first. "Everyone will think I'm disgusting," she said. "No one will believe me." But I couldn't let it go. Quietly, I started collecting what I could: old phones, emails, photos, messages. I went to her old high school, asked about him. Most people didn't want to talk, but one young teacher, new at the time, remembered seeing Daniel and Emma in his classroom after hours. "They always said they were working on essays," she told me. But it didn't feel right. I found old photos on Emma's laptop, pictures of her school projects, class events, and one of her and Daniel standing too close, his hand lightly on her shoulder. At the time, no one thought much of it, but now, knowing what I knew, it made my stomach twist. When I showed the photos to Emma, she broke down. "He said he loved me," she sobbed. "He said he'd wait until I was ready. He had groomed her, manipulated her for years until she believed his love was real." I couldn't stand it any longer. I went to the police again, this time with everything I had. They opened an investigation quietly. It wasn't easy. There were years between what happened and now. But the evidence, the messages, the timeline, it was enough to raise serious questions. When they called Daniel in for questioning, he played innocent, of course. It was all legal, he said. She was an adult when we started dating, but he didn't know what we had, the proof that it had started earlier. Emma had to give her statement. Watching her sit in that room, trembling, trying to tell strangers what had been done to her, it broke something inside me. The investigation went on for months. Rumors started spreading at the school. He was suspended, then quietly let go. His reputation shattered. But none of that brought Emma peace. She started seeing a therapist, trying to piece herself back together. Some days, she was strong. Other days, she couldn't get out of bed. And then, one afternoon, as we sat on the porch drinking tea, she said something that chilled me. "Mom," she whispered, "there's something else you don't know." I looked at her, afraid to ask. She took a deep breath, eyes glistening. "When I was 17, there was a baby." Michael's face drained of color as he stared at the papers in front of him, the deeds, the bank statements, the trust fund that bore my name. His jaw clenched, and his voice trembled when he finally spoke. "You're telling me, all this time, you had money? You made us believe you were poor?" I nodded slowly. "Yes, for 20 years. Sarah stood up so fast her chair scraped the floor. "Why? Why would you do that to us? Do you know how guilty I feel now? How humiliated we'll look if people find out?" I looked at her, my daughter, who used to braid my hair when she was little, who once cried when she scraped her knee and ran into my arms for comfort. "Humiliation?" I whispered. "That's what you care about?" Tears stung my eyes, but I didn't look away. "Do you know what it's like to sit alone on your birthday, waiting for a single phone call that never comes? To pretend not to hear your own child's laughter in the background when you call them? To hold on to old photos because they're the only proof you once mattered to someone?" Silence filled the room, thick and suffocating. Eric broke it first. "Mom, I don't understand." "Why didn't you just tell us? Why not say you had money?" I turned to him gently. "Because I wanted to know who you were without it." He looked down, ashamed. "I watched all of you build your lives," I continued. "I saw who you became when there was no wealth to gain from me. You all had choices. Some of you chose kindness when it was convenient. Some of you chose distance because I didn't fit your world anymore." Michael started pacing. "You think this is fair? You lied to us for decades." I met his fury with calm. "And you lied to yourselves, telling me your lives were too busy for love." Sarah sank back into her chair, her hands shaking. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. I walked to the chest again, pulled out 3 envelopes, and placed them. In front of each of them, their names were written in my handwriting, neat and deliberate. "These are for you," I said. "Open them when I'm gone. They contain what you truly deserve, not by birthright, but by heart." Eric's voice cracked. Mom, don't talk like that, but I smiled faintly. I'm old, my dear. I've made peace with time. What I need now isn't years, it's truth. Michael sat down heavily, his eyes darting between us. You planned this? All of it? Yes, I said softly, because sometimes, to see a person's soul, you have to take away their mirror. For the next few hours, we barely spoke. They sat there, my grown children, each lost in their own storm of thoughts. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the small room. It felt like the ghosts of our past were sitting there with us, the laughter that once filled our home, the dinners we never shared again, the love that had slowly been replaced by pride. Finally, Sarah whispered, Mom, I'm sorry. Her voice trembled. I was selfish. I cared too much about appearances, about what people thought. But when I lost everything, you still opened your door. I don't deserve your forgiveness. I reached for her hand. It's not about deserving, my love. Forgiveness isn't earned, it's given, and I've already given it. She cried, then deep, heavy sobs that came from years of regret. Eric moved closer too. Mom, I should have been there. All those times I promised to visit. His words trailed off, broken by guilt. You were the only one who never turned me away, even when I didn't deserve it. I smiled sadly. You were lost, Eric, but you came home. That's what matters. Then there was Michael. He hadn't moved for a long time. His face was unreadable, his eyes hard. Finally, he said, You think this changes anything? You think hiding your wealth made you some kind of saint? You've made fools of us. I looked at him with a calmness that came only from heartbreak, long accepted. No, Michael, I didn't make you fools. You did that to yourselves. He stood abruptly, shoving his envelope into his jacket. I can't do this. He stormed out, slamming the door behind him. The sound echoed through the house, leaving a silence so deep I could hear my own heartbeat. Sarah wiped her tears. He'll come around, she said softly, but I wasn't sure. Pride had always been Michael's greatest inheritance. That night, I lay in bed unable to sleep. The memories came back: birthdays, graduations, Christmas dinners that never were. I thought of Michael's first steps, Sarah's piano recitals, Eric's laughter when he used to chase fireflies in the yard. I remembered the mother I used to be hopeful, naive, proud. And I realized she was gone long ago, replaced by a woman who had watched love fade like old paint on a wall. Yet, beneath it all, I still loved them, fiercely, unconditionally. Even Michael, especially Michael. In the days that followed, Sarah and Eric stayed. They cooked, cleaned, and helped me around the house. It felt strange, almost like I was living in the shadow of a past that could have been, if only we'd learned to love each other sooner. One evening, as we sat watching the sunset from the porch, Sarah turned to me. Mom, what will happen to everything? The houses, the money? I looked at her, my voice quiet. It's all already written. The lawyer will handle it when I'm gone. Eric frowned. But, Mom, I interrupted gently, don't worry about that now. Just promise me one thing. They both looked at me. Promise me you'll stay kind, that you'll look after each other when I'm no longer here. Family isn't built on money, it's built on love. Don't forget that again. They nodded, tears glimmering in their eyes. That night, I sat alone by the window, the moonlight spilling. Across the old letters and photographs on my table, my husband's picture smiled up at me, and I whispered, They finally know, John. They finally see. But deep down, I knew the story wasn't over. Because pride has a way of returning when the dust settles, and Michael's silence, I sensed, wasn't the end of it. It was only the calm before another storm. That evening, I sat alone in the living room. The house was quiet, too quiet. The ticking clock on the wall felt louder than ever. I stared at the family photo on the shelf, the one where all of us were smiling, arms around each other, as if nothing could ever go wrong. But behind that photo was the truth I could no longer ignore. My son hadn't just borrowed my savings, he had lost them gambling. The business he spoke of never existed. And worse, the house I loved so much was now under his name. When I confronted him, he didn't deny it. He just looked away, ashamed, but silent. "I thought you'd understand, Mom," he whispered. "I just needed one more chance." I wanted to scream, to shake him, to ask how he could do this to me after everything I sacrificed. But when I looked into his eyes, I saw the same little boy I once carried in my arms. I said only one thing: "I gave you my trust, and you sold it." He had no answer. He just walked out of the house, my house, closing the door softly behind him. I sat there all night, listening to the wind outside, wondering when love had turned into something that could hurt this much. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of knocking on the door. It was the bank officer, polite, professional, and completely unaware that every word he spoke was tearing me apart. "Mrs. Carter, I'm afraid the property transfer has been completed. Unless the debt is cleared, the house will be repossessed within 30 days. 30 days. 30 days to say goodbye to the place where I raised my children, where laughter once echoed through every room." After he left, I walked through the house, slowly touching the walls, the old piano, the window where I used to watch the sunrise with a cup of coffee. Every memory felt heavier than the last. My daughter, Emma, came over that night. She hadn't known what her brother had done. When she found out, she cried harder than I did. "Mom, move in with me," she said, holding my hands tightly. "We'll get through this, together." But I shook my head. "This house isn't just bricks, Emma. It's where I just learned what love costs." That night, I packed a few clothes and sat by the window until dawn. I didn't cry. Not anymore. I had no tears left, only quiet strength. When the morning light finally broke through, I realized something. Maybe losing everything was the only way to see what truly mattered. Weeks passed. The house was gone. The belongings I had cherished, sold, or donated. I moved into a modest apartment, far from the neighborhood where I had raised my children. The walls were bare, the floors creaked, but for the first time in years, I felt a strange clarity. Stripped of illusions, I could finally see the truth of my relationships without the distra. Eric came to visit almost every day. He had started a small business of his own, one that struggled but showed promise. He wasn't bringing gifts or money, he was bringing himself. He cleaned the apartment, cooked meals, and told me stories about his failures and triumphs, never hiding his shame or his mistakes. I realized then that love, real love, was quiet, steady, and patient. It didn't demand perfection. It simply, Emma, too, began to visit regularly. She brought warmth and laughter to the apartment, her presence a balm for years of sorrow. And while Michael still avoided me, his silence, no longer held the same power. I had learned to exist in my own truth, and in that, his absence felt less like abandonment and more like a mirror reflecting what. One afternoon, as Eric and I were fixing a leaky faucet, he stopped and looked at me with an, "Mom, I don't know how to say this, but I've realized something," Eric said, hesitating as he shifted his weight from one foot to the other. His eyes were fixed on the floor, yet I could feel the trembling in his voice, the raw vulnerability he usually hid behind sarcasm or silence. "All those years I ignored you, I was terrified. I was afraid you'd see me as a failure, and I guess I thought you wouldn't love me if the words hit me like a sudden gust of wind, fragile, tremulous, yet carrying the weight of years I had spent longing for such honesty." I reached out instinctively, brushing my hand over his, feeling the warmth, the pulse, the human hesitation that had been missing in our I've never stopped loving you, Eric, not once, not even when you forgot me, even when you disappointed me. "That love isn't conditional," I whispered, letting the words sink into the spaces between us, into the years of Sile. He swallowed hard, and I could see the tears threatening to spill. "I want to make it right. Not just with you, but with Sarah, with Michael, I don't want to. And in that moment, a fragile hope stirred in my chest. Not the kind tied to money or property or appearances. Those things had lost their meaning long ago. No, this hope was different. It was built from trust, honesty, and the courage it took for a grown man to face the mistakes of his youth. It was hope rooted in the knowledge that even fractured relationships could begin to mend. For days, Eric stayed close, helping me around the apartment, cooking meals, sharing stories about his business and his mistakes. We laughed together in small moments, quiet, understated laughter that carried a deep sense of relief. It wasn't loud or joyous in the way it might have been 20 years ago, but it was real, and that was enough. Emma came over frequently, too. She brought warmth and laughter into the apartment, and in her presence, I could see the past and the present coexisting. The little girl who used to braid my hair, the young woman who had once resented my rules, now a companion, steady and loving. Together, Eric and Emma began to rebuild the rhythms of family life. Cooking, cleaning, sharing quiet evenings, watching the sunset. And in their gestures, I recognized the subtle truth I had longed for. Love shows up when it matters most. Then one morning, a letter arrived. I found it resting on the small kitchen table, an envelope in Michael's handwriting, neat and familiar. My hands trembled as I picked it up, and for a moment, I froze, unsure whether I wanted to open it or set it aside. There was a weight to it, a significance that made my chest tighten with anticipation and fear. Finally, I unfolded the letter. Inside was a note, simple, yet heavy with emotion. Mom, I was wrong. I was selfish. I thought wealth defined our worth, but I see now I was blind. I don't expect forgiveness, but I hope, in time, we can rebuild. Michael, I held the letter close to my heart, letting the words sink in. For the first time in decades, I felt the tremulous relief of recognition, the acknowledgement that even the hardest hearts could soften, even if only slowly. I realized that pride, fear, and stubbornness had held Michael captive, just as they had sometimes kept me trapped in my own expectations. And now, in this single letter, a bridge had been extended across years of distance, and I could feel the fragile beginnings of connection. I spent hours holding the letter, reading and rereading the words. I thought of all the moments I had missed, birthdays, school plays, milestones I had only watched from afar. And yet, I felt no anger, no resentment, only understanding. The past could not be changed, but the present and the future could still hold love. In the days that followed, Eric and Emma continued to fill the apartment with life. Eric shared his failures without shame, his hopes without hesitation. Emma offered her care freely, her laughter breaking through the shadows of what we had lost. And though Michael had not yet visited, I felt his presence through the letter, a promise of potential reconciliation, a sign that even the most distant of children could find their way back. I realized then that my long experiment, the 20 years of pretending poverty, had not been just about testing my children. It had been a test of endurance, a crucible in which the depth of my own resilience and capacity to love unconditionally was forged. I had learned patience, the quiet power of forgiveness, and the understanding that love does not require proof in wealth or gifts, only presence, honesty, and courage. Every day became a new lesson in rebuilding trust. I learned to accept help without shame, to share without fear, to laugh without hesitation. I learned that my heart could stretch again and again to encompass mistakes, regret, and the fragile beginnings of reconciliation. Then, one quiet evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I sat with Eric and Emma on the small balcony. The sky was painted in shades of pink and orange, and the city below buzzed with life, indifferent to our small world of renewed hope. "Mom," Eric said softly, "I know I can never fully repay you, and I can't undo the past, But I want to be here. For you. For us. For what's left of our family. I reached for his hand, gripping it tightly, feeling the warmth of life, the strength of presence, and the fragile, powerful beauty of trust being rebuilt. It's never about repayment, Eric, I whispered. It's about showing up, about being present, about choosing love even when it's hard. The words lingered, between us, an invisible tether connecting our hearts. And in that moment, I understood the full truth. I had spent 20 years trying to prove love cannot be measured by money, appearances, or convenience. It is revealed in quiet gestures, in loyalty, in the courage to face what has been broken and to keep moving forward. I knew then that I had won, not through revenge, not through manipulation, not through tests or trials. I had won by enduring, by loving without expectation, by holding on to hope even when it seemed impossible. And in that, I felt a strength I had never known, the knowledge that love, when real, endures, transforms, and ultimately redeems. Holding the letter from Michael once more, I whispered into the quiet of the apartment, "This is enough. We are alive. We are together. And we will heal." For the first time in decades, I truly believed it. The mountain air was crisp as Emma and I arrived at the small cabin we had rented for the months past, and life settled into a rhythm I had never expected. Eric's small business began to thrive slowly but steadily. He was no longer the reckless, distant child who had abandoned me for years. He had grown into a man who carried his mistakes lightly, not as a badge of shame, but as lessons to guide him forward. Emma, my daughter, had found a fragile peace. She had divorced her husband and returned to a life less glittered but richer in honesty and love, and she now spent her days helping Eric manage the tiny office that smelled perpetually of paper and coffee. And then there was Michael, my eldest, whose pride had kept him away from me for decades. He hadn't yet fully re-entered our lives, but the messages, the tentative visits, the awkward apologies, all of them were signs of a change, however hesitant. I no longer worried about money, nor the fleeting approval of my children. The apartment I now called home was small and modest, its walls bare and its furniture mismatched, but it was alive with the pulse of presence and laughter. Every corner held a small victory. The sound of Eric's clumsy cooking, Emma's quiet humming while she folded laundry, the occasional squeal of excitement when they both got a small success at work. For the first time in 20 years, I felt fully seen, not as a woman who possessed wealth, but as a woman who had endured, who had sacrificed, and who had loved without measure. One afternoon, I found myself walking through a small park near my apartment. Children chased each other across the grass, their laughter ringing like wind chimes in the sunlight. Parents called after them with gentle authority, sometimes kneeling to tie shoelaces or soothe scraped knees. I watched a young boy help his mother pick up a dropped toy and felt a pang of nostalgia so sharp it made my chest ache. That was the childhood. My children had once lived under my roof, yet so many moments had slipped through my fingers. And yet, I did not feel the bitterness that had haunted me for decades. There was clarity now. Loss and betrayal had stripped life down to its essential truth. Love was not measured by luxury, by grand gestures, or by appearances. It was measured by loyalty, presence, and the courage to face truth without flinching. When I returned home, Eric and Emma were cooking together in the small kitchen. The aroma of garlic and simmering tomato sauce filled the apartment. Laughter bounced between the walls like sunlight. I paused in the doorway, taking it all in. These imperfect, tender moments was more valuable than any mansion, any inheritance, any bank account. My 20-year experiment of pretending poverty, the silence I had imposed, the careful observation of my children, it all led me here. Not to revenge, not to triumph, but to understanding. Later that day, Michael stopped by. He carried the same careful composure he had always worn, like armor. Yet I noticed the lines of tension and age on his face that hadn't been there decades ago. There was an awkwardness in his steps, a hesitancy in his voice. He had been raised to believe pride equaled love, yet now he was learning that humility might carry it further. "Mom," he began, pausing as if testing the words before letting them leave his mouth. "I know I can't undo the past. I can't take back the years I ignored you or the moments I put pride before love. But I want to try if you'll let me." I studied him for a long time, seeing beneath the facade of success, the armor of arrogance, to the vulnerable man underneath the boy who once sought approval, who once ran into my arms after a scraped knee or a broken toy. I reached out and placed my hand over his. "Michael," I said quietly, "love is not measured by perfection, or by timing, or by what was taken or left behind. Love is a choice every day, again and again. If you're willing to make that choice now, then I am too." His eyes shimmered with unshed tears, and for the first time in decades, I felt that fragile, tremulous relief of reconnection. It was not a perfect reconciliation. Life never grants such clean resolutions. But it was real, and that was enough. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, letting the silence envelop me. I reflected on everything I had endured, the loneliness, the betrayal, the quiet heartbreak of watching my children's hearts reveal themselves over 20 long years. And yet, I understood finally that my experiment, my long and painful test, had been about more than revealing my children's true characters. It had been about discovering my own endurance, my own capacity to love without expectation, and my ability to forgive. I remembered the bitter nights I had spent alone, the tears I had shed quietly, the moments when I questioned if I had ever mattered to anyone at all. And now I saw that all those moments were not wasted. They had forged me, tempered me, prepared me to receive my children not as they had been, but as they had grown flawed, imperfect, human, but capable of love. Days became weeks, and weeks became months. Eric continued to grow in his independence. Emma continued to provide warmth and laughter, and Michael, slowly, began to bridge the chasm of pride and distance that had separated us. In these moments, I discovered that love doesn't die in betrayal. It is patient, it waits, it softens, and when it is finally acknowledged, it transforms into something stronger, more resilient than before. I began to write letters again, this time not to test anyone, not to plan or observe, but to capture the raw beauty of the moments we were finally reclaiming together. Letters to my children, letters to myself, letters to the memory of my husband, whose faith and family had always been unshakable. I wrote about forgiveness, about patience, about love that endures beyond the petty missteps of youth and the arrogance of adulthood. And as I penned these words, I realized my greatest lesson. Wealth, property, or status never defined the worth of a family. The real inheritance is love, patience, understanding, and the courage to face the truth, even when it hurts. It is the ability to forgive, to rebuild, and to hold space for the people you care about, no matter how long it takes. That night, as I closed my journal and placed it on the nightstand, I felt a quiet strength settle over me, not pride, not triumph, but the deep, enduring knowledge that I had loved fiercely, sacrificed wisely, and remained unbroken. And in that moment, I understood that my life, though scarred and tested, was rich beyond measure. I whispered softly into the stillness. Love doesn't die in betrayal, it transforms, and so did I. And for the first time in 20 years, I truly believed it. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe, and feel free to share your story in the comments. Your voice matters.